Hello all and welcome to this, the Fireside Chat with Liam O'Keefe from Tyre Stewardship Australia. I'm sure some people are coming into the webinar room right now. This is the next in the Rawtec Webinar series. We've called it a Fireside Chat. I don't know if you can actually see in the background there, that's my attempt at a fire on the wall there, so I'm going to stay nice and warm. The Fireside Chat started in the 30s with Roosevelt. And he could quell rumours and explain his policies to his listeners. And I'm hoping Liam can do that today in the tyre space. And it's also maybe a bit ironic because I've heard that some tyres may be burnt, but I'm not sure. We'll talk to Liam about that today. So I'm very fortunate to talk to Liam O'Keefe, the Senior Strategy Manager at Tyre Stewardship Australia, or TSA. TSA was formed in 2013 to implement a national tyre product stewardship scheme here in Australia and promote the development of viable markets for end-of-life tyres. It's voluntary and industry-led. Check out the website. There's a cool new video I saw actually, Liam, on there. It looks great. Great little summary of what you guys are doing and what you've done. Liam, as part of a Churchill Fellowship, has travelled around the world to find out more about recycled tyres. He's worked across Australia, so he's seen it all. So we're really fortunate to have Liam here today. Just a bit of housekeeping before I hand over. Questions throughout. You'll see there's a question and answer box, I think down the bottom of the screen. So if you've got a question, put it in the Q&A box, not the chat box. Put it in the Q&A box because the chat one we won't look at. We'll look at the Q&A one, and if it's appropriate to answer throughout, I will. But if not, we'll leave it to the end. There's also, it's going to be recorded today. So just a note that this will be recorded. And we're going to try to keep it to 45 minutes if we can, if not a bit less. So I know you guys are all busy. There's a broad experience in the audience. So we're going to cover some stuff that's a bit more broad and basic, and some things that are a bit more detailed in tyres. And as you'll see, you think tyre, you think, oh, that's simple, but there's so many options. There's so many things happening and so many things you can do with recovered tyres. So now that we've done that intro, welcome everyone and welcome Liam. Your website indicates there's about 56 million tyres discarded in Australia per year. That's a scary stat. We're fortunate enough that most of us have cars in Australia, but this means there are lots of tyres being worn out on our roads, plus there's trucks, planes, other automobiles that have tyres as well. Can you tell me more about, prior to COVID happening, what were the sources of our tyres? Where were we getting this tyre waste from, and where were these going previously?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And look, firstly, just before I kind of jump into the numbers, I'd just like to say thanks for the opportunity to talk with you and everybody who's kind of got involved and spending the time with us for the next 45 minutes. It's great. Enjoy the opportunity. It's great working with Rawtec. I thank you for facilitating the conversation. Tyres can kind of be off the side of the waste conversation sometimes. So it's good to bring people together and have the opportunity just to discuss some of the issues. There's a lot going on in the space, which we'll cover throughout the session. But as you said, it can be quite a simple, it's perceived to be a simple market, but it's often quite complex. And as you touched upon, there is, quite a daunting resource challenge that we need to face in the fact that, there's 56 equivalent passenger units of tyres, so 56 million equivalent passenger units, and around over 1 billion tyres reach, the equivalent of 1 billion tyres reach end of life around the world annually. What that equates to, we talk about 56 million equivalent passenger units. It's a way of kind of quantifying for the everyman, what that might look like if it were tyres. But really what it means is, an equivalent passenger unit is 1 tyre. You've got a truck tyre, which would be 5, and mining tyres, which would be, the equivalent of the hundreds of passenger units. But when it comes to it, we produce about, 465,000 tonnes of end-of-life tyres every year. And it's kind of broken up into 3 main types of tyres, really. Talking about the passenger units, which are the largest type, they make up about 40% of the end-of-life waste chain, and that equates to about 190,000 tonnes. And then you have the truck tyres as well. That's about 34% of the market. and that's about 160,000 tonnes, equivalent to 160,000 tonnes. And then finally, you have, you know, the OTR, which are the big kind of mining tyre, agricultural tyres, and they're about 25% of the market, which is about 120,000 tonnes. I mean, in terms of what happens to them, you know, in some ways, you know, there's some really positive aspects to the sector, and that, in that sense, I'd say that the resource recovery sector, you know, the recyclers and the collectors are doing a great job, and as are the retailers as well in terms of accumulating that feedstock. And about 90% of the passenger units are recovered, which is great. And a large percentage of that's recovered, about 80% or 85% of the passenger units that are recovered are exported as a tyre-derived fuel. That's where the majority of passenger tyres go. But it is good that 90% are recovered. The same kind of number is relevant to the recovery of truck tyres. Again, 89%, around 90% are recovered, which is great. And, you know, a large percentage of those go to retread market. And you know, again, this is where the majority of the recycled crumb and passenger tyres, crumb comes from. It's mainly made from truck tyres, and it's about 17% of all the truck tyres are processed into higher value products which are consumed locally. So that's really positive, but I mean, that's the good side of it. So overall, we have about a 70% recovery rate in Australia, which is great. But if truck and passenger are at 90%, you know, what's the element of the sector that kind of needs work? And that's the OTR sector. The reverse applies for them. It's only about 10% that's recovered, and 90% is a lost resource, predominantly buried in pit or disposed of at mining sites in remote areas. So that's an area that needs a hell of a lot of work. But, you know, and TSA is kind of working towards that. But, I mean, you know, we're set up on one thing that I appreciate the introduction you gave about TSA being a voluntary scheme. But the way we're funded is a 25-cent levy of the importation of tyres into Australia, which is paid voluntarily by the major brands, you know, being Bridgestone, Continental, Goodyear, Dunlop, Kumho, Michelin, Pirelli, Toyo and Yokohama, and also Volkswagen. Also, they pay a levy voluntarily on the tyres they import into Australia. But it's only on the passenger and truck tyres at the moment. So the majority of the work that we undertake and the majority of the conversation that we'll have today will be in reference to the passenger and truck market, because that's the accessible market. But we are looking to approach the OTR market, and maybe something we can talk about a little bit later as well.
Yeah, and often when I say to people I work in kind of that waste recycling, resource management space, I say, oh yeah, and I say, well, take tyres for example, and I use that as an example and say, here's all these options for it. You think you've got all these people out there that have a car, the tyres at the end of life, what happens to them? That's just one area, and think about the complexity behind where they go. Just recapping some of the things you said there, it's interesting that you mentioned tyre-derived fuel, or TDF, and OTR are some of the acronyms coming through. So can you just explain for those that might not know what tyre-derived fuel is? That you were saying most of the recovered passenger tyres are going overseas as tyre-derived fuel. What does that mean?
Really, it's kind of tyres are shredded, you know, it's predominantly around a 6-inch type size, and it's predominantly to be burnt in cement kilns as a replacement, cement kilns and mills as a replacement for coal. So it replaces that. So it's a legitimate product. It meets a specification, and there's value in it, particularly when you consider the excessive supply of waste tyres that we have. We do need, you know, everyone talks about crumb, and we do need a lot of crumb and high value products. And TSA does work on that, but at the same time, we also need outlet markets that are commensurate to the supply of waste that we have. And TDF is a kind of mainstay of the global kind of supply chain, in that it takes a lot of tyres around the world. You know, it's pretty much one of the biggest consumers of waste tyres is a replacement for coal being burnt to produce heat in kilns. You know, we don't have much of it in Australia, but what we do is, you know, shred those tyres in Australia and send them to supply overseas markets, predominantly in Korea, Japan, Malaysia, and India. But you know, as the conversation progresses, that's great that we do have those outlets. If you're able to access those markets and there's ongoing consumption, what we've found of late is that sometimes those international supply chains can be disrupted, and that creates issues. And you know, some of the circumstances we have with the global pandemic has created some issues for the waste sector locally. But so that's what, in essence, that's what tyre-derived fuel is. And OTR, off-the-road tyres, which are used on those really large vehicles.
Yeah, and quite a different thing for those that aren't aware. You've got a passenger tyre, which might be 8 or 9 kilograms at the end of its life. Some of these OTR tyres, mining tyres, can be 4 or 5 tons. So it's quite a different beast you're dealing with. Thanks for clarifying that. We did have a question: are there any facilities in Australia currently using tyre-derived fuel or TDF? By the sounds of it, most of it's going overseas, is what you're telling me. Most TDFs?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, we don't have we don't have consumption of tyre-derived fuel in cement kilns in Australia. Multiple reasons for that, but predominantly it's because there's a large availability of cheap coal in Australia, and also there's technical elements around the types of kilns that are utilised in Australia, and also the fact when you use multiple feedstocks, it creates challenges in terms of temperature control and the like. So, but it is a focus, and we are engaging actively. And I know the large recyclers in Australia are pretty keen to get local TDF outlets. The reason being is because it does insulate against some of these factors in foreign markets that, you know, we really need to be able to do to create that domestic demand, to create a more self-sufficient Australian market.
Yeah. And that's sounding similar in a lot of different sectors as well. How can we bring manufacturing onshore so it kind of loops back here versus relying on those overseas markets? And we'll get to, so some of the, there's been a question about the ban, the tyre export ban, which we'll talk about shortly, and also some of the impacts of COVID. So we'll talk about that just before we do. But before COVID, again, what was some of the more, I suppose, innovative or new things, that developments that you guys were seeing here in Australia for tyre recovery?
So in terms of, going back to the 25% levy, it funds TSA, we get around $4 million a year, and we undertake a number of activities, one of which is the accreditation and compliance of the end-of-life supply chain. So accrediting retailers, collectors and recyclers to try and ensure that they meet minimum standards in terms of business practices and that they're taking tyres and sending them to appropriate places. The other side of the equation, as you touched upon there, Matt, is assisting in the development of markets, and that's probably been my main role for the last 5 years. As previous to being this strategy manager, I was working as the market development manager, and I really love doing that. It's a great opportunity. We've worked with a range of different sectors and markets. So in terms of innovative projects that we've worked on locally, we started off with some R&D around permeable pavements, which was great, with Melbourne University and a company called Merlin from Tasmania. And that's looking at utilising pavements that have a 50% tyre aggregate and a standard aggregate. So they're flexible, they drain, and potentially can consume around 3,000 to 5,000 tonnes of tyres per annum if that was taken up as a local government kind of mainstay. We funded some early R&D, proved it in the lab, and then with Mitcham Council in South Australia, we've done large-scale implementation of that. And that company's that's led to a formation of a company which is commercialising, and they reckon that they can turn over millions, tens of millions potentially in that market. So that's an example of an early-stage project that we funded, worked in the lab, did a demonstration element to it, and now it's working in a commercial sense. One of the other kind of interesting and innovative projects is a company called Flexi Rock. And they've got a number of projects where it's kind of similar, that they use a kind of a rubber kind of granule or chip type material, and then mix it with concretes and the like. They've created explosive resistant buildings, which unfortunately are in more and more demand given the state of the world at the moment. And that's excellent. That they've got potential projects coming up in the Middle East. We're talking to the Australian Defence Force about using the impact absorption characteristics of the rubber to protect buildings. So that's some of the more innovative, smaller stuff. That's in the civil infrastructure space. We think that's a really important one, but they're kind of smaller projects that ideally, cumulatively, take up a lot of demand over a period of time. But the mainstay of our market development program is in the road sector. We've done a hell of a lot of work in that space in terms of increasing the consumption of Australian tyre-derived product as a modifier of bitumen binders to enhance the performance and longevity of roads. That's been going really well for us and for the sector. The feedback we get from recyclers is that they're selling more crumb than they ever have, and it's predominantly built upon the back of that high value consumption from government and local government and road authorities in that sector. So should I talk a little bit more about that, or did you have any?
Sure. No, I mean, yeah, it'd be good to know a bit more about that. And also, if you can thread in there, we've got some questions about, because there's a challenge with tyres, often the recycling or recovery option is the end of its life and you still have to make a new tyre. So there's not that nice loop back, if you like, quite often it's put into a road or it's burnt or whatever, which is great because it's replacing some other potentially virgin materials. But you still need to keep creating tyres. So if you could thread in, maybe expand more on that, but also, are there any potential avenues that loop it back into creating new tyres or anything like that?
Yeah, look, it is, when people talk about circular economy now, and, tyres are circular, and, there's this expectation that you can process them and put them back into the manufacturing of tyres. There's challenges with doing that in Australia. One, we don't have any tyre manufacturing in Australia, so it's very difficult to input back into that market locally. But, in a pure sense, that would be great. But I also see the circular economy as being about, longevity and enhanced performance, but also the fact that, we use tyres on roads because, we drive a lot, and the more we drive, the more roads we need. So, there is a kind of synergy between using tyres in that road kind of framework that, the more roads we have and the more we drive, the more we require tyres. So if we are generating that waste as a matter of deriving it from that type of activity, then, I think there's almost like some sort of an alignment there that if we can incorporate that waste stream into the manufacture of a very closely aligned, infrastructure, then that does provide more of a closed loop there. So I think there is a bit of an imperative, and the road guys get that. They really do see that there is an alignment there. So, over the journey, TSA's, as I said, it's a mainstay of our market development program. We've funded about $5 million worth of work over the last 5 years. A lot of that has gone into, initially working with the road sector and the Australian Road Research Board and Pavement Association, and working with the state road authorities to change the specifications to allow crumb rubber to be more easily utilised. Then we've worked with them to do what we call demonstration projects. So, representing how crumb rubber, bitumen products can be utilised, and to demonstrate that they can be used. And then probably the latest phase of what we're doing is to fund infrastructure with industry partners that consumes tyre products. So, but just, the demonstration projects we've done are with like City of Mitcham in South Australia. We've also working with Logan City Council. We have a project that's being rolled out with 5 local governments in South Australia at the moment, in Port Adelaide, Mitcham again. But what we need to do then is enable the industry guys to manufacture specific products that are crumb rubber centric. So, we're co-funding infrastructure with Puma, Bitumen, Boral. We're talking with Fulton Hogan. Who else? I should have a list here. I should have it there. But, all the main producers and Downer. And really what that is to do is to enable the production of that crumb to consume. It kind of hardwires that consumption of crumb rubber into the market. So, if we co-invest in that infrastructure with them on a dollar for dollar basis, that creates an ongoing market for the recyclers to sell that through on an ongoing basis year after year after year. And the fact is the recyclers can sell that product for $600-700 a tonne. And we've seen that market increase by literally thousands of tonnes. So that's an influx of millions of dollars to that recycling market to enable them to invest in that infrastructure that's required to process Australian tyres to a higher quality, to be able to diversify that Australian market so that we do have more products being consumed locally. So the roads is great in terms of the consumption and the tonnages, but also the beauty of it is it creates the return on investment for recyclers to invest in infrastructure. Once they've got that infrastructure, they're then able to supply to a more diverse kind of, market, such as civil infrastructure. Then we've got more processes. Ideally, we can get some more TDF being recovered, not recycled. I see someone says TDF is not recycling. It's recovery. It's, it doesn't have to be, not everything has to be recycled. It just has to be used productively for you know, in some way, so that it's not creating a detrimental impact on the environment. But we need a range of utilisation.
Yep. Yeah, and it's one of those ones. It's not like, oh, there's this great alternative, which is a nice recycling option, and no, we're sending it to be burned. It's like, well, no, it's actually quite challenging. There's a number of options. They're not going to be able to take all the tons. So if it's not
exactly,
it's probably going to get buried or something like that. So it's a hard one.
It is.
And that's the better option at the time. And speaking of which, so TDF, I assume, has been impacted by COVID. So I'm keen for you to just kind of summarise what have you seen as some of the impacts of COVID that's happened recently, and how do you think that's going to kind of is it going to change things for good, or is it going to go back to normal? I know you pull out your crystal ball, but I suppose what are the first kind of things that you saw happen with COVID? How has it impacted the recovery of tyres here in Australia? And where is it heading in the future?
Well, it's an interesting, like, it's such a big ongoing kind of cumulative coalescent, you know, problem, but or issue that has really impacted the waste market, or so many markets, you know, basically the global economy. But how has it impacted the tyre market in Australia? Well, to begin with, you know, what you'd say is that there's been a decline in sales roughly around the world of, you know, around 20% in terms of passenger units. And, you know, that could be represented as to be a really good indicator of kind of global, you know, GDP. You know, if you're seeing that decline, it's probably a real kind of representation of that decline globally in general activity. But, you know, aside from that element, you know, it really has had impacts on global supply chains, and the waste sector is a supply chain, really, just at the end of life of material. So, and it has had impact there. I mean, what I would say though is that there was a lot of ructions or kind of disruptions, whatever you want to call it, or changes that were occurring in the waste tyre market for an extended period of time. You know, the COAG ban, as we touched upon, you know, the ban on the export of waste, which is slated to come in December 2021. You know, even the kind of the vector of that, or the fact that it was going to be coming, was impacting the market, you know, to some degree. It was changing the circumstances. It was making it more challenging for some businesses, particularly balers, to get material overseas. Then there was another factor on top of that, was India had some policy changes towards the end of last year where they weren't receiving as many tyres. They were reviewing, you know, licenses in relation to pyrolysis and other businesses that take baled tyres. So that really constrained demand. So, you know, there was businesses which were predicated on, you know, getting a cheap gate fee, getting material through quickly and sending it overseas. And they were feeling that disruption. Basically, the global supply chains weren't taking as many tyres, and if they were, the price was going up to get rid of them. So you had this happening at the start of the year. Then, you know, you got those factors. Then you had the kind of, you know, COVID circumstances above that. It really has kind of exacerbated those circumstances for some of those businesses. And one of the reasons is that the waste business model, traditionally in terms of our foreign markets, is a reverse logistics kind of model, in that a lot of material comes in from overseas, you know, or for the goods we procure, computers, shirts, etc. And it goes back empty. So that was an avenue to move Australian waste to other avenues, like quite cheaply, and avoid landfill disposal costs in Australia. But what's happened is, with the decline in manufacturing overseas and decline in consumption in Australia, it has meant that we haven't had the shipping freight coming in, which means we don't have the volume going out. So that means that there's real pressure for outlets for Australian waste in general, to the extent that, you know, balers who were trading overseas were potentially getting paid for their baled material overseas. Maybe we're collecting on a gate fee where they could get paid on the back end. And then very quickly that circumstances has changed, so that, you know, shipping containers to send your material overseas can be $2,000 to $3,000 paying to get it overseas. And that's changing as circumstances are changing. But what it's meant is that, you know, a term I've been using, which isn't that, is that the market's constipated, in a sense, in that you can't get it's blocked. We can't get it overseas. And that's a global factor at the moment, you know. And another factor on top of that is the fact that, you know, that with COVID, the oil prices have declined, which meant coal prices have declined, and TDF, as we touched upon earlier, is a replacement for coal. So if the replacement that it's for coal declines, then, you know, some people, they might not want as much TDF as they'd wanted, which means that globally there is a real demand for those outlets. So there's a real issue in the Australian market at the moment through COVID, and that has impacts for, you know, EPAs, responsible authorities. You know, myself and my colleague Julie, who manages the accreditation and compliance, and CEO Lena, we talk with, you know, our EPA colleagues around the country, and, you know, they're dealing with individual sites that are challenged because they can't get rid of this material overseas as they had been able to previously. And, you know, they're seeing on a state-by-state basis, but, you know, what we're seeing is that there's a trend nationally for sites that are under stress because we are feeling the impact of global circumstances. So, you know, one of the things that we're trying to do is to communicate with our EPA, you know, collaborators, and to say that, you know, there's a global circumstances at the moment. So we really need to take a national approach to how we deal with the circumstances, because, you know, we all have our own patches, but when it goes well, it's good. But when it goes bad, as it has the potential to, we're all kind of bound. The recycling market, the retailers, you know, the EPAs, you know, we all need to work together to alleviate the circumstances. And I think now is a really, you know, pertinent time for us to work together to try and address some of those, to see how as a country we can you know, deal collectively with some of the challenges that are being faced by the sector.
Yeah, so do you see, and we'll get on to COAG in a second, but do you see then, talking about that onshore manufacturing and onshore things, some of those technologies and options into roads and for the concrete that can take some impact, etc. Do you see those things as growing a bit? Is there other technologies such as pyrolysis that might grow a bit? What are your thoughts on some of those other things that don't involve international export and maybe can be done more onshore?
Look, yeah, and look, I think you touched upon, you know, sometimes people say, well, this will be the answer, or this will be the answer. But, you know, I think it's cumulative increases in demand in multiple sectors concurrently, which creates, you know, a more significant impact when you combine those elements. You know, if we can get 10, 20 projects that consume 3, 5, 10,000 projects each of, you know, the particularly passenger tyre product, you got 50,000 tonne, there's 10% of the market. Great, you know, that's a really good first step. You know, of the passenger tyres, is what I'd say is 190,000 tonne. You know, if you can get a third of that in that civil infrastructure market, that's excellent. You know, if we can get 1 or 2 cement kilns, then, you know, they're consuming locally, that also is really productive. But one thing I will say is it's a very transitional time, and there's unfortunately, there's businesses under stress. But what we're seeing is a change in the market dynamics in a major way, in the sense that, and this is COAG ban as well, that if it is removing baling from the market, then, you know, we're talking about the back end market as well, but also if recyclers get the true cost of processing at the gate, then they're able to reduce their back end costs as well. So, you know, one of the implications for the COAG ban and the elimination of baling, which is, you know, it's happening anyway. The COAG ban's kind of, it's superfluous at the moment because you can't export. Whatever the COAG ban was going to do, have a look around, because you're seeing it happening now, probably more so because it's impacting TDF. So gate fees will be, you know, really significant. And what that does, it means if there's better gate fees, then maybe we can go to the local TDF and the, you know, the cement kilns and say, well, all right, well, you know, we can potentially have better contracts on an ongoing basis because we have more surety of projecting income in terms of those gate fees, so that we'll look for local outlets. So that's one element. So pyrolysis is another one you touched upon, but I should take a breath before I go into that. But, you know, so, you know, there's a lot there. But, you know, I suppose what I will say is that the TSA mandate is to support local markets, diverse, and, you know, across a range of sectors. And, you know, and pyrolysis is one of those. We're technology agnostic. You know, whoever can process in a safe way, produce a product, and they meet the standards of the territory in which they're operating, you know, we support those initiatives, those processing initiatives. but it's a new emerging market. I think, unfortunately, it has been tainted to some degree with, kind of early gold rush kind of technologies, which potentially weren't as developed as they need to be. But, as the market circumstances are changing, as we just touched upon with gate fees, I think business models which were previously out of the realms of being viable may well start to become viable, particularly if they're able to process volumes onshore. The challenge is that, those markets aren't there because it is such a new emerging sector that they haven't been able to get the sophistication in terms of, one, the supply of the material. It's just not there. We really only have one large-scale pyrolysis proponent processing to a large degree, and that's Pearl Global. They're the only TSA-accredited thermal processor at the moment. They're up in Queensland, and they report they're processing tons. They're producing, a carbon char. They're producing oil, but they're struggling for local markets. And what I've always said to any pyrolysis proponent who knocked on the TSA door is, we're not going to fund you to set up your infrastructure, because we have processing equipment. We've got conventional processors who process large volumes safely. So, but when you're set up and you can make a product, we'll help you try and sell it. And that's what we're seeing now. We're starting to see more sophistication in the sector. I think it is maturing. I think there is more ability to create, higher quality at back-end products. So, hopefully it is able to be a growing component of the multitude of demand type outlets that we need to have a viable and, strong local, tyre consumption market.
Yeah. And I think there was a question on available technologies in Australia to convert tyres into energy and useful materials. I suppose pyrolysis would be one example of that, but as you say, there's one plant that, and the end products are a gas, an oil, and a char, and the steel.
Yeah.
And it's always that challenge of finding markets that can use that, either overseas or ideally.
Just to clarify there, Matt, so because I don't want to get any other operators offside, but there are other operators that are, they probably have, more, they're not commercial scale. What's the term? They're set up and they are operating and they're producing, but they're not reporting to TSA. We don't know their volumes. And they're not taking large volumes consistently. That's probably where I differentiate, because the question comes to me, does pyrolysis work? And I say, yeah, define work. How do you define working? Do you define work as technically being able to process it and have a product at the back end? Yeah, pyrolysis works, but that's not what the game's about. The game is about having a viable business over an extended period of time that is self-sufficient. That's what I define as pyrolysis working. And, we're seeing businesses starting to get to that point, but they still are, to some degree, relying on funding, seed funding, capital raising, etc. We're not seeing that self-sufficient, independent, but that's because they are a formative sector that's an emerging sector. So I didn't want to put anyone else offside who'll say, no, we're processing in Australia. I'll say, yeah, well, you are, but where's your reporting on your volumes? How much of your product and who are you selling it to? We don't really see a lot of that.
Yeah. No, thanks for clarifying and thanks for the question there. So I'm going on to some of the questions from the audience. There was some on the COAG ban. I know you've touched on it. So just to clarify, everyone, COAG, the Council of Australian Governments, last year put a plan to ban the export of a number of different product or recycled products, one of which was baled tyres. And as you said, Liam, by 2021, I think. But prior to COVID, it probably was going to mean a bit more, but now that COVID's happened and Indian government have said, we don't want to take as many baled tyres, etc., it's probably not going to impact us as much. But can you expand a bit on do you see the COAG ban playing a role at all, or do you think, now that this COVID stuff has happened and all the overseas stuff's happened, it's probably not going to change too much? What's your opinion there?
Look, the COAG ban will, what I meant by that, it's kind of superfluous in the sense of what's going to happen. What we're seeing now is kind of almost like a magnified version of that. But what it will do is it creates consistency and surety for investment for an extended period of time. Because, already we're seeing some of the heightened impacts of COVID, both locally and globally, dissipate to some degree in varying degrees. In Australia, it's very thankful that we're seeing that so that businesses can return. but we're kind of somewhat in a bubble, as is New Zealand, and we hope to be in a combined bubble in time. But you know, hopefully Queensland comes to the party there. But the question was, yeah, the coag ban is important because it creates a consistency and expectation that those circumstances will continue to prevail for an extended period of time. And that enables more surety with investment in the longer term. So in that sense, it's a real positive. The other element is, you know, if it removes baling from the market, then it provides a better gate fee for recyclers. You know, probably the other side of the equation is that there's a lot of smaller bale operators out there. And they're, you know, they're legitimate operators. They operate around the world. They're not doing anything illegal at the moment. They still can maintain their business activities. But, you know, obviously there's an indication from the government that they want to see more sophistication and more, you know, kind of development of the sector. It's not to say that the ban is completely agreeable. I think there's some elements of it that could have required more work. You know, I think the federal government, it's interesting the federal government jumped in with the ban. You know, as somebody who works at a product stewardship organisation and has worked in government, you know, state government, you know, there's been a lot of lobbying for the federal government to play an active role in the waste sector for a long time. And the stance has been, no, it's a state problem. We don't touch it. So it's, you know, they have decided to intervene at this point. You know, but from the perspective of a product stewardship organisation, you know, potentially we would have liked to, what I would have liked to have seen is that intervention. You know, we do a lot of work to lead up to a ban. You know, we could have had 3 to 5 years of planning for it to develop those markets locally. I think the intent of the ban is good, but, you know, maybe it could have been done in a more coordinated way over an extended period of time to enable the sector to be more robust locally. And so we aren't as susceptible to some of the extreme kind of conditions which we are feeling now. You know, that's the way it is. That's the rules of the game, and we'll do the best that we can with all of our stakeholders to make the most of it. Yeah.
There was a question on the TDF being viewed as banned product in 2021. I assume that's no, it won't be viewed as banned. It's only whole bale tyres.
Pretty much, yeah. It's whole bale tyres. That really, when you're talking about the ban, that's it. It really just bans the export of whole bale tyres overseas. And, you know, I talked about, you know, what was the numbers? 150,000, 160,000 tonnes, you know, are exported locally of tyres. Passenger units are exported. You know, it basically means that I think around a third to a quarter of those are bale tyres. The most likely impact of the ban will be that tyres that were formerly, you know, the 30 or 40,000 tonne that were formerly baled and sent overseas, they'll probably be shredded prior to going overseas. There'll be a pre-processing opportunity in Australia prior to it going overseas, assuming that TDF, and that's probably one of the other elements of the ban. It will have a lot of positive impact, but it is a very rudimentary tool. The flip side of it is, should TDF demand crash, then, and it really means that all of our eggs are in the one basket, and it's the TDF basket. And if TDF declines, then there isn't much, you know, the beauty of having bale tyres as purely in a practical sense was that it allowed that to, you know, to, sorry, someone's just at the door. It allowed those outlet to kind of move between the demand of those two types of materials. You remove the baling, it's all in the TDF market. So it's a risk. It's a risk that we're taking, but I suppose the calculations have been that it's a risk worth taking in order to support the local resource recovery industry. But, you know, we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah. There was anonymous said you're referring to quantity of tyre recycled exports. Do you have numbers? I think on your website you'd have some numbers on exports and things like that. And
yeah. So what was the question, sorry?
So quantity of recycled tyre exports, etc. If someone wanted to look at the stats a bit more, they could refer to your website first.
Yeah. So basically, you know, of the passenger tyres, 160,000 tonnes are sent overseas, which is 60% of the passenger units. About 115,000 tonne are shredded, and about 50,000 tonne are baled. But obviously, that was pre-COVID. You know, it's a whole new world out there.
But have a look at the website there. They'll be referred.
And just on that, Matt, sorry, just one thing. TSA, one of the roles we play, we've talked about market development and accreditation and compliance, but we also do a lot of work in providing information to the sector. And we've just undertaken an extensive materials flow analysis, an independent review of tyre arisings. And that report if it's not out, it's very soon to be out. We've just finished it, final version. It's looking pretty, it's looking great. So we have the most up-to-date version, information of what's been happening. Obviously it was finished in January, February. We know what happened since then. But if you're talking about the waste tyre generation on a state-by-state basis, that report will give you as good a national representation as you'll get. It's the fourth version of a series of reports that were initially started by the federal government. So it's really worthwhile having a look at it if you're interested in the local numbers.
Yeah, and I do advise anyone to look at the TSA website. They've got a video that kind of summarises some of those options as well. And then there's plenty of reports and data there as well. A question we did have from Karen, I think you might have answered already, but the TSA market development, did you mention before, was that some of that recent work that you're doing? What were some of the wins and learnings? Is there anything you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Appreciate the question. And because she's in Karen's Gomez from a voluntary product stewardship as well. So we share a lot of the challenges and joys of working at a small product stewardship organisation in Australia. But, you know, the roads is a great win. And what I will say is that in Australia, we do things very, very different to the way anybody does it around the world. Nobody really has a program of market development like we do in Australia. It's quite unique. So, you know, we've had some learnings, but the biggest learning I'd have is that just go to have industry-focused and integrated projects. Research and development is good, even if you're doing R&D. Align it to industry because, you know, you really need... The research could be really good, but if there's no commercial partner who is there to exploit or utilise the beneficial elements of what the R&D kind of finds, then the work doesn't go anywhere. So, you know, relationships with end users, with industry, and ensuring that they're a critical part of every project is probably the key to it. We funded work previously because it was good R&D, but good R&D on its own doesn't necessarily lead to market impact. And we're here to fund impact, not processes, not studies. We only fund it unless it delivers that objective of benefit to the resource recovery industry. So that's probably the key things is that, yeah, and the other thing is that it's great with the road sector, we funded particular work, but the beauty of it is when it gets to a cumulative point that the market runs with it themselves. People, you know, the demand has been created in the road sector. So now we're just seeing businesses themselves that are developing it. You know, the Alexicrum product from Puma, you know, has 10% kind of in the mix, you know, and they're just going with it because now they know that that's what government wants. They want that product. So it's now in business. Once that's created, the precedent is created, the demand's created. It just has momentum on its own. And that's the beauty of what we're seeing now.
Yeah. Look, we're almost out of time. There's a few other questions there. What I would say is check out the website. And Liam, you said you're happy to share your email address as well. So if anyone, I think you all should have my email address. If you want to forward me a question, please do, and I can pass it on to Liam and get you in touch. But I think that's been a great summary. To cap off, Liam, if you just want to give us some key, and this kind of answers one of the questions. What are some of the things we can do, or what are some of the key barriers that we can help lower to increase just recovery of tyres in general in the future?
Look, when we say we, it's a question of which we is it. But I mean, as a sector, you know, I think it's, you know, procurement is the thing because, you know, I'm guessing the stakeholder group we have here is you know, that procuring Australian produced products, you know, simple, but, you know, we have cheap imports. We have imports undercutting processes in Australia. And, you know, those processes need to be supported. And the majority of the procurers of roads and civil infrastructure are government who would bear the risk as responsible authorities of mismanagement of that material, so they can contribute to that solution by procuring. You know, I think the other thing that we can do is strengthen product stewardship in Australia. Product stewardship is a way of getting industry to contribute to solutions that work for responsible authorities, federal government, and you know, and EPAs. So. And we can get the money from industry and direct it to benefit society and, you know, different markets. So, I mean, you know, we're a voluntary scheme, as you touched upon, with those eight brands that I talked about that pay the levy. You know, there's another 20 or 30 that import, sell tyres, make a profit, and don't contribute to the solution. And I don't think that's acceptable. And the federal government can play a role in, you know, just ensuring that anybody who imports products above a certain threshold, you know, they contribute. All they've got to do is just come to the party, because, you know, I think that would, you know, one, provide more resources, but it also means that it's a collective issue that the industry is dealing with, and you know, that we can, you know, work together. It would kind of overcome some of the perceptions of, you know, externally of the tyre industry kind of owning TSA. That's not the case. I think in some ways, when people are voluntarily paying and contributing to a solution, you know, it creates some issues there. Finally, I think what can we do? Basically, as I touched upon, is there's some, I'm not going to say unprecedented circumstances, it's been, but, you know, there's some incredible challenges that the sector's facing at the moment. And if we don't deal with them together, then we are all going to bear the brunt of it. So, you know, EPAs, you know, responsible authorities, tyre importers, tyre recyclers, you know, and I think, you know, just to finish, I'd say it's one of the, you know, we talked about the money we spend, we've talked about what TSA does in that regard, but I think one of the most underrated roles that we've been able to play, and Karen would probably communicate a similar thing is being stewards, is bringing the sector together and creating a forum to facilitate conversations between organisations and sectors that just didn't talk before. You know, we facilitate conversations with the road guys to recyclers, you know, with the retailers to the recyclers. That's an incredibly vital, you know, kind of element, is just being able to bring people together. And I think, considering looking at the circumstances we have now, there's no better time. There's been no more desire or need for that type of collaborative approach than the circumstances we face at the moment.
Great. Thanks again, Liam, and some good questions in there in terms of that were asked, but also that we didn't get to, for example, minimising the generation of the waste in the first place. It often gets forgotten. So I think some of those are definitely worth sending to myself, and I'll put you in contact with Liam if you do want to forward them on. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance. Again, this will be recorded, so you can listen to it later or forward to others. We've got another webinar coming up in a fortnight on getting community buy-in for fortnightly waste. That's particularly of interest in Adelaide. So we're going to be hearing from this fortnightly waste collection of at your curbside. So we're going to be hearing from Bega and Melville councils. So that's coming up. But once again, Liam, thanks very much for your time. Always a pleasure. And yeah, everyone stay in touch, and good luck getting through this COVID period together.
Thanks for having us along, Matt. Really appreciated the opportunity. It's great.
Thanks all.
Thank you.